Today, we're putting theology on trial, a trial by logic. We're breaking down a text that applies the strict, cold rules of formal logic to one of the most complex subjects imaginable.
So, can teleology actually hold up under that kind of intense scrutiny? Well, the source material we're digging into, the logical supremacy of the perfect agent model, argues that yes, it absolutely can. But there's a condition. It only works if one specific framework is followed, without any exceptions. Let's see what that unbreakable rule is.
The author's entire argument, the whole thing, hinges on one single, non-negotiable principle that comes from classical theism. And that principle is aseity.
Now, what on earth is aseity? Simply put, it's the idea that a being is completely uncaused, totally independent, and not derived from anything else. The paper makes a really bold claim here. This isn't just a characteristic of God, it is the very definition of God. So if a being is caused or derived, well, by this strict logical definition, it just can't be God, full stop. This is the single absolute test every model is about to be judged against.
So the author builds their entire case on this really clean syllogism. It's presented as just pure, simple deduction. Premise 1, God is uncaused, right? That's aseity. Premise 2, a son who is begotten is, by definition, derived from something. So what's the only possible conclusion? That a derived being can't be God in the same fundamental way. The paper argues that to claim a being is both derived and underived at the same time is a straight-up violation of the law of non-contradiction. It's like saying a circle is also a square. So the really crucial question is, how do other well-known models handle this apparent contradiction?
Okay, with that rule firmly in place, the paper applies this Aseity test to two other major theological frameworks, and it argues that when you put them under pressure, they logically self-refute.
First up, the Roman Catholic model. The paper hones in on the idea that the Son is a co-producer of the Spirit. This, it argues, creates a produced producer. Just think about that for a second. A producer that was itself produced. This immediately creates a fatal contradiction, because it suggests the Godhead is composite, that it's made of parts, and that violates a core classical rule known as divine simplicity, which is the idea that God has to be absolutely simple and indivisible. Next, the paper looks at the Eastern Orthodox model. Now, the author admits this view gets closer because it correctly identifies the Father as the single source, but it still claims the Son is an equal Almighty. So when the logical question is asked, how can a derived being be equal to its underived source, the paper says this view just retreats to mystery. The author labels this a logical fallacy called question begging. It's not an answer, it's a refusal to answer the contradiction. So, after pointing out these logical problems, the paper presents its solution, the perfect agent model, which it argues is the only one that actually remains coherent. And this is where the whole thing just clicks into place. The model completely replaces the idea of an equal essence with perfect representation. The source argues that trying to share an indivisible essence is a logical contradiction. Like that square circle, it's impossible. But delegating indivisible authority, well, that's perfectly logical. Think about a king handing over his seal. The focus shifts entirely from being God to perfectly representing God. And this ambassador analogy just illustrates the concept perfectly. The ambassador acts as the king. He has the king's authority, but he isn't the king himself in his very being. In this view, the Son is functionally almighty. He's acting with the Father's full authority, but he isn't ontologically the uncaused source. And just like that, the logical paradox is resolved. This is exactly how the model interprets scriptures like Colossians 2:9, the one about the fullness of the Godhead dwelling in the Son. The paper frames this not as some metaphysical merging of being, but as a complete and total delegation of authority. The Father pours his will and his power into his agent, who then uses that power over all creation. And all the while, the uncaused source remains perfectly simple and undivided. Now, the paper's analysis doesn't just stop there. It actually addresses a huge criticism about the nature of suffering before it delivers its final verdict on all the models. So a really common objection here is that if the Son isn't ontologically God, well, doesn't the cross lose its meaning? The paper argues that the exact opposite is true, and that its model actually presents a greater, more profound kind of divine love and suffering. The author argues that what it calls the agony of the witness is way more profound. Instead of God sort of paying himself, which feels like an internal transaction, this model presents a perfect lover, the Father, who has to watch his perfect agent be rejected and killed.
According to the text, this allows God to suffer in a relational way, without breaking that core rule of divine impassibility, the classical idea that God's perfect nature cannot change, suffer, or die.
After that final, crucial point, the text presents its ultimate conclusion in a really clear comparative table, ranking each model based on how it stood up to this logical audit.
And here you have it, the final ranking according to the source. The perfect agent model scores number 1 with what the author calls total logical integrity, because it resolves the paradox of aseity and presents what it calls a greater form of suffering. But look how the other models get marked down specifically for their logical failures. The Eastern Orthodox model gets flagged for question begging on aseity, and the Roman Catholic model is critiqued for systemic and circular contradictions, which is why they end up with those lower rankings.
So, according to this very rigorous logical audit, the perfect agent model is put forward as the only one that stays fully coherent, from beginning to end. It protects that core definition of God, it validates the Son's authority, and it provides a framework for divine love that, according to the author, earns it the top rank.
And that really leaves us with one final thought. The paper presents an incredibly compelling and, you might say conclusive, case for its own logical superiority. But it also invites a much bigger question about the role of logic itself when we try to understand the divine. What you should take away from this is not a final answer, but a really structured framework for asking that very question yourself.